It is Friday, April 4th. Let's talk PlayStation. Welcome back, everyone, to another $80 episode of LTPS. It's been a very interesting week, so we've got a lot to talk about. So let's begin, as always, with a very brief reminder for the PS Plus Essential lineup. April games, now live on PSN, so add those to your library. And going into our first minor news story, it's about the PlayStation Store wishlist, which, for those that don't know, it's got a 100-item limit, so you can't wishlist more than 100 games. So not many people are probably hitting that, but usually if you do hit it, kind of annoying, obviously, because it's like, why is that limit there? Well, now it would appear as though, anecdotally spotted on the PS Studios OT on ResetEra and then reported by Push Square, that some people can now wishlist beyond 100 games, so it can go up to maybe like 180, 200 possibly, I don't know. I have not tested it myself, but hey, nice to have. It's one of those arbitrary things that, again, most people probably don't hit, but it's a handy feature. Like if you're trigger happy, I can see how you hit 100 games pretty quickly because it's so handy to, turn on the notification settings on PS5 to where you're notified if a game goes on sale from your wish list. So you could probably hit 100 games pretty fast compared to like that 1,000 game limit for PS4 saves via PS Plus. That's arguably a higher thing, but still something that people sometimes do tend to hit, and that is still a limit. But for wish listing on the PS Store, it seems like you can go beyond 100 games, so that was at least welcomed sort of stealth info to learn about this week. Moving on to some Naughty Dog and The Last of Us news, where for Part 2 Remastered on PS5, it got the new patch for the new content in the no return mode, so the new characters, the new maps, but it introduced a problem for those playing on the single-player campaign where you don't lose progress, but you do lose resources. So I guess some people are saying that they lose the progress that they made on the skill tree from the medicine pills that you pick up, and then also the weapon holster and what they're carrying, like that vanishes. So very weird, more so if you're playing on, let's say, a harder setting like Grounded, where resources are very scarce. So that just, God forbid you were playing the game right in the middle of this patch deploying. That is not cool, so I guess they'll have to look into that. And then we also had the PC version come out yesterday, and we're finding out, like a lot of other recent PS Studio PC launches, that this game has problems. Now, the problem is not really as bad as the disastrous launch that Part 1 had when it came out on PC. It seems like the game is playable and it's like fine, but it's the optimization which is really weird. Like there's a very strange delta as far as like the type of hardware you might throw at this game. You might be just barely scratching up to base level PS4 or PS5 levels as far as the sort of graphical fidelity you can get out of this game and how that relates to the frame rate and resolution. So it's very weird how that turned out. It very much does kind of boil down to sheer optimization, which I believe it is mostly Nixxes Software that was leading the development on this in collaboration with Naughty Dog and Iron Galaxy. We've seen a number of PC launches just kind of have the same story where like there are issues and they've really fumbled the ball here as far as what we've always said, or at least the point I always make in that if they're going to start doing PC launches and shipping on that platform, this is your golden opportunity to make sure these games come out clean, polished, and they're super playable and they run well on a wide variety of hardware. And it just seems like now they're sort of going in the opposite direction, where most often now these games need work after they launch. So really disappointing to see that, but hopefully Naughty Dog and Nixxes Software can get on top of these issues sooner rather than later. In other Naughty Dog news, it seems like both PlayStation and the studio are looking to repackage The Last of Us again, but it seems as though it's probably just Part 1 and Part 2 put together. So based on this report from Bilbo Kuhn writing for Deal Labs, where they make this claim that there's going to be a new physical edition of The Last of Us for PS5 coming to retail, they mention that they don't know if it's the first or second game or both, but they do know it's a special edition being priced at $109.99 USD or 119.99 euros, and they expect the announcement and pre-orders to open within a 2-month window. So kind of conservative there, but considering they always get these sources from those in either retail or it's press marketing materials, or they're seeing like back-end leaks on sites, usually that's how they get this information and that's how they're so accurate. But considering it's retail side and we have the price, like, is this not a dual pack of both games? So it's not really all too shocking with the HBO series starting up season 2 very soon. You probably want a nice, attractive product there at retail for console players to go out and get the series and start it from game 1 and play all the way up to game 2. So, that's not really all too shocking. I will say, though, I'm curious what it will look like. Are we talking about a slipcover with 2 standard game cases inside and they didn't do anything else? Or is it a separate special plastic case where it is all discs in that one case, but it's new art, maybe a bigger box edition with some collectible goodies in there or something? I don't know. I mean, that's really the only question we have, but it does seem like, yeah, they're probably trying to just prop this thing up next to the Season 2 premiere, or maybe the ending if they're, giving a 2-month window on this thing. Moving on to Sucker Punch and Ghost of Yotei, where over on PlayStation.com, the official landing page for this game was updated with some new text that gave us some slightly more descriptive answers as far as the plot synopsis and what we can expect from this game. So over on PlayStation.com, it says, and I quote, "Filled with fury and determination, Atsu will hunt down those responsible for the death of her family and exact her revenge. Every odd job and bounty will provide the coin she needs for her journey, but how she fights, survives, and evolves the legend of the ghost will be up to you. Ghost of Yotei features new mechanics, gameplay improvements, and new weapons for Atsu to master, including Odachi, Kusarigama, and dual katanas." I'm still of the mind that I hope this game does give more player agency as far as where the story ends up going. I don't necessarily need like all these various branching paths that then lead to 20-something plus different endings, but I very much do want it to, at the very least, be this possibly 50-50 approach where, Tsushima kind of was leading you down that path. No spoilers, but it's just a matter of, the game does kind of feed you that idea of you can be an honorable samurai, or you can go against the grain of what it means to be a samurai, which then leads to the image of Jin being the ghost of Tsushima. But, regardless of which you choose, the game just sort of steers you in one way and you get kind of the same outcome, right? So with Atsu, I really do want to see it be something where there's a little bit more choice as far as, how you do choose to play and how that does heavily influence everything around you. And there are 2 paths that start to really diverge based on what the player is doing. But having said that, still loving everything I'm hearing so far. And given the site was updated recently, and we are getting close to May, and late May is where we've seen Sony hold State of Plays right before Summer Game Fest, it would seem as though we are getting very close to possibly getting that release date announcement and trailer for this game. So let's hope that is very much the case. Now, something else we might hear more about very soon, and I mean very, very soon, is Marathon, because Bungie is ramping up some sort of ARG campaign with the game. So the Twitter account put out this very deliberate tease, and then all the PlayStation social media accounts put up some Marathon key art and imagery. So it seems like they're getting ready to show more of this game. Now, considering Bungie is still technically not a part of PlayStation Studios in the traditional sense, obviously we know back on office operations and things like that, and Sony stepped in and this, that, and the other, but still they're very much sort of independent in the sense that like they'll probably be doing this outside of a state of play, I would imagine. So I don't think, given the proximity of where we are right now, which is still early April, and we expect a state of play in late May, I don't think those 2 are necessarily going to play out together, so to speak. So I would imagine this Marathon thing is probably going to have a resolution fairly soon, you would think. But Marathon is something that, Bungie and now by proxy PlayStation have a lot riding on. So I think there's a lot of people, especially those hardcore Bungie fans, that are looking very closely at this game to see what it actually is shaping up to be. And we might have that answer soon. Moving on to some news that's not quite directly PlayStation related, but I hope it does become a thing eventually. And that is Nightdive Studios, which, for those that don't know, Nightdive specializes in bringing back older games, abandonware, games that just have either lost rights or the rights have become problematic, but they do step in, sort of mediate that, and they do a lot of ports, remasters, remakes. And now they are putting the call out there that they are ready for Xbox 360 and, yes, PlayStation 3 games. So recently, the studio was speaking with VGC, and so Nightdive Studios head Stephen Kick and director of business Larry Cooperman said that they are ready to look at potential remaster projects for games that only shipped on PS3 and 360. So Cooperman said, and I quote here, "I would begin asking a couple of questions. Was it an Xbox 360 exclusive, or was there a PC version out there too? Because that also changes things. The little preservation that's available, do we have source code? If so, what's the quality of the source code? How about the assets? Those are the kind of considerations that we have there. That being said, there were some really good games that came out in that era that shouldn't be lost." Now, regarding PS3 and the architecture being a challenge, Kick said, and I quote, Yeah, definitely. I think that architecture, I mean, I remember the talk when the system was first released of how difficult it was for developers to get it, and that's a big problem with backwards compatibility. So yeah, if we get to that, or I should say when we get to the PS3 era games, it will be a challenge that we have to face. But I think that we've had enough experience to where we can do a serviceable job on a PS3 remaster. Now, Nightdive is in a somewhat comparable position to implicit conversions. They both get there in different ways, obviously, and their model is a little bit different as far as how they bring forth older properties to modern hardware, but the end result is still the same, which is getting these older IP back on new platforms. And so I found the story noteworthy in that you've got a studio that specializes in this segment and putting the call out there. It's almost like very much an open casting call of, we're ready to do these projects. We want to do an interview and talk about this. We want to get our name out there, and we want to see, like, put some feelers out there. And in the context of PlayStation and Sony and PlayStation 3, yes, let's get the ball rolling on this. I mean, this is the opinion I've had, for a while when it comes to PlayStation 3 games, and that, I've always been the sort of, I guess, big bad here, where I have to constantly remind people that PS3 emulation is a massive pain. There's so many financial hurdles as far as not just, the resources that go into it, but also how do you monetize it and make it financially viable for Sony and everybody involved. And, is the hardware even there when we're talking about very CPU-bound games, and that's the cell processor. And so it's the same points we always make. But, when you consider all of those hurdles, this is why I make the point of, like, maybe it makes more sense to just go back to some of these properties and just finance individual ports of the games that we're still missing. Your Resistance, your Infamous, your Killzone, your MotorStorm, your Puppeteer. I mean, don't get me wrong, there's a lot of games, and an emulation layer would absolutely still be needed at some point in time. But, when you think about some of the bigger names out there and maybe what makes more sense financially, and also what might also be a better result for the game itself if you do just finance a port, I would think that is a better proposition. That, and we see Sony has this willingness to license out IP, as we talked about recently with the news of Patapon and Hot Shots going, and they did it with Freemore's Remastered. And, I think Sony's in a different place nowadays where we can all agree they don't have the resources to be able to do these port projects in-house, and sometimes even finding outside studios isn't necessarily that easy. But I mean, you look at a story like this, you see Nightdive just putting an open call out there. We're ready to take this work on. Let's get that partnership going. I would certainly hope, if Nightdive is not knocking at Sony's door, maybe Sony would reciprocate and reach out to them. All these older PS3 games that I just listed off, the ones that were owned by Sony and they were made by Sony, I mean, these were PlayStation developers that are still around. I would think, depending on the studio and what they were doing as far as archiving back then, but they probably still have source code. They probably have a lot of materials that went into making those games. They're probably, I would think, well positioned to collaborate with a team and get these games financed and shipped and playable in a good state on even PS4 and 5 when we're talking about ports, because emulation would be incredibly problematic and damn near impossible on, say, PS4. But PS5, PS5 Pro, get some native ports going, and I think you know where I'm going with this. Let's see this collaboration happen. Like Haze came up, Haze of all games, which kind of is an abandonware game. That was a good example in that, with Free Radical and the team that went into making that game, and it was a very problematic title. We looked into that for the PSR series, and Nightdive even mentioned, like, they would ask the original team members, what went wrong here? What would you like to change? How should we approach this game and maybe right the wrong that was done in the past? So it was a really fascinating article and conversation, and I can fully back something like that happening down the road if Sony is looking to finally get these PS3 games on new platforms. Okay, let's move on to our big news story from this past week and how that may or may not relate to PlayStation in just a few years' time. And that is the Nintendo Switch 2 Direct, the big live stream where we were all waiting for Nintendo to finally lay it all out there and talk about this hardware, show off features for the Switch 2, announcing third-party partnerships, first-party reveals, accessories, services like NSO getting GameCube stuff, and more importantly for a new console, launch details. So pre-orders begin April 9th, it launches June 5th, and it starts at $449 USD for the base machine, and then $499 for the Mario Kart World Bundle. and everything so far sounds about right, but it's the a la carte game pricing which is concerning, and that we now have a new peak of $79.99 USD for games like Mario Kart World and the Switch 2 editions of Mario Party Jamboree, Tears of the Kingdom, and Kirby the Forgotten Land. Now, other titles are 70, some are 60, so it is only some titles, but you do have that. There is also the physical game issue of the game key cards, which are online based, and that's not really what we're here to talk about right now, but there's that. If you're in Europe, there actually is a difference between physical and digital as far as pricing goes, so that's where you are hearing the $90 price come in. That's euros, not USD, but it seems like in Europe there are some examples where a game will be 79 digital, but it'll be 89 at retail, so kind of insane, and that is concerning. It's deeply concerning. And the thing is, yeah, the hardware was kind of in that ballpark. I think building up to it, it did seem like, you know, early on the idea was, okay, probably $399, but with the tariffs and, you know, the cost of building an SoC, it's like, okay, $449 is not that unrealistic either. So that's kind of where we were expecting it to be. But game pricing, yeah, it's shocking, absolutely shocking. I think many people were not expecting 80, given that Tears of the Kingdom was the first, you know, mid-cycle game that Nintendo did where they bumped it up to 70, and the expectation there is kind of like, okay, they're going to go all in on 70 by the time Switch 2 does come around. But no, they are going to certainly put an $80 price tag on some of these games, and at least in the context of Nintendo, where their games seldom go on sale, that means like Mario Kart, for example, that game is going to be 80 USD for most of its time on the market. We're talking 7-8 something years, which is kind of insane to think about. But it does still beg the question, despite all the pushback we're seeing. Oh boy, well, that's not just a publisher, but a very big established platform holder. Put it out there. $80 games, is it the new precedent that's being set, and will other publishers follow? Like, for example, you've got Rockstar coming very soon, where arguably they might be the only big publisher in the short term that could, you know, price a game at, let's say, $80, and I don't want to say get away with it, but it is one of those games where, like, if they price it at 80, it is still going to do incredibly well. Arguably, that's kind of where Nintendo feels they're coming from, because they're putting that on Mario Kart, and it's Mario Kart. They've sold, 40 something million units of that game on Switch. It's just the game that is like a mandatory buy for so many families when they pick up a Switch. But I digress. It's like in the short term, GTA 6, and then what about where we go from there? What about Sony Interactive Entertainment? They were one of the first publishers in 2020 to do $70 games for their titles, alongside 2K and a few others. But, you know, oddly enough, it is still something where, like, nowadays, at least at the very minimum, if there is some sort of silver lining we can try to find here, there is a lot more exploring the price spectrum going on, in that, you know, games like Split Fiction will come out at 50, Astro Bot at 60, Helldivers 2 at, say, 40, right? So even SIE, for example, they do explore that price spectrum. So it's not quite like the PS2 days where no matter what the game was, almost always it was, say, $50. Same for like the PS3 cycle. But, you know, we are seeing the price be explored. So there's that. But it is still pretty brutal, and it is shocking, more so because, like, and this always comes up, and it oftentimes it has to be said in these conversations, which is, yes, adjusting for inflation, these games still, even at $80, are cheap relative to games, you know, 20, 30 years ago. That's always the argument. But the thing is, that can be true, and it is true. It's factually true. I would even go off on this tangent and argue that as far as content within games go, they offer so much more than games 20, 30 years ago did. And I know people love to just immediately raise their hands and go, what about microtransactions and season passes? Okay, you don't buy any of that stuff. These games, pound for pound, generally across most genres, just have so much goddamn content in them versus games from 20, 30 years ago. But that's not... Besides the point, those things can all be true, and they are true, but it still doesn't change the fact that an $80 video game is a ton of money. And in this very uncertain microeconomic environment where people, unsurprisingly, are going to be very aware of their spending habits and concerned for the cost of living and groceries, and I mean, entertainment at that point takes a back seat. Right, and that's the tough reality of it. Video games are, in many ways, a luxury, a hobby, a very expensive hobby, and it's like, 70 was tough for families. How is 80 going to be any better? I don't really like the direction where games should get more expensive that quickly. I mean, you would think that, okay, by 2027, maybe for PlayStation 6, and I don't think that's really necessarily great either, but something has to give, and I don't think charging more for the games is that direction where it should go, right? I would be more in favor personally of a pullback on other aspects of games, like, for example, the content. I mean, I really do stand by that, as far as like, it's such a bad faith argument of, well, games how long ago were complete. It's like, guy, I mean, yeah, but if you don't buy any extra things for your games, this has been my mileage. These games are so long, and they're so content rich, and there's so many things you can do, and you get so much more mileage out of games. And subscription is insane nowadays. Even if you don't want to like buy games a la carte, like, you just get so much out of these titles nowadays. And I would be in favor of a pullback on that if we are dealing with these 6-7 year dev cycles, and the labor can be very expensive, and you should be paying these staff good wages to make these games. But if you want these titles to get out in a quicker turnaround time, and I wouldn't necessarily have a problem with these games maybe scaling back in that regard, just so that the budgets are a little bit more in control. And there is always the possible use of AI, where it could be a safe extension of human work, but you all know I don't really think that's where that's going to go either. So I just hate that, like, the ceiling keeps raising on these video games, and surely Sony and many other publishers might look at this, see the reaction, and I mean, Nintendo usually is a very firm company. It takes a lot of pushback for them to make changes, and sometimes they do that very reluctantly if they have to. So we'll see how that plays out. But the one thing we also have to acknowledge going into our next story is that here in the US, we have more tariffs being put into place very soon, which is going to create a very uncertain time, especially given that these tariffs apply to damn near everything now. Not just, all products, of course, but every country of import and trade. So the Trump administration announced that on April 5th, there will be tariffs applied to all countries. So some specific locations like Japan will be 24%, China is 34%, Vietnam is 46%. Any country that's not listed on the sheet they put out, it's at a rate of 10%. And, as we've said, like before, these things kind of change very quickly, and sometimes delays happen. But it seems more and more clear that maybe something is going to be put in place within the short term, and it will be in place for a short term period. But when we talk about consoles and games, and more so physical games, Nintendo, this is a problem. I mean, arguably right now they're sort of insulated to a degree with that $450 price tag for their hardware, and they're doing something in Japan where, since the console and games are all manufactured there, they're actually quite cheap there when they're making a Japanese only Switch, and there's a multi-language Switch. That's kind of how they're approaching that for that machine, and that makes sense for them, obviously. But it's just that if they were to move that stuff outside of Japan, that 24% is going to really eat into physical game cards that they're trying to sell, and of course the hardware. So that $450 might already be reflective of that and the $80 price tag. They might already be trying to insulate from that. I mean, these companies aren't dumb. They are well aware of the administration and want to be ahead of these things. But when you look at Vietnam at 34%, where they're trying to move production lines to places like Vietnam, well, that doesn't really look all that good. And that's the same case for Sony. So this kind of dials back again to PlayStation, in that in the here and now, when we talk about every country having some sort of percentage eat into their margins, that's going to look, I want to say ugly, but you just never know how these things are going to play out. What's also so complicated is that I'm already seeing some do that like napkin math of like, oh, so 46% from Vietnam, you just apply that to the blanket MSRP of PS5 and it goes up to an absurd price. But that's not really how it works. Sony does have a margin in place that, as of right now, certain PS5 consoles, I believe all of them now at this point are profitable. There's been many quarters now at this point where Sony does make it clear as a line for increase in operating income and revenue that they're seeing an increase in PS5 hardware profitability, which, is great for Sony, but it also gives them that wiggle room to possibly absorb these costs. Because ideally, Sony, sure, they like making money and they'd like to have an excuse to raise prices if they have an excuse. But in the grand scheme of things, they can't keep increasing the price to where it becomes detrimental to the volume of sales that they could have otherwise, right? There is that tipping point where a higher price isn't necessarily worth it. And the console model has traditionally always been that it's a low price box. They're meant to be an affordable option. And the platform holders won't be able to maintain that if this does go into effect for any sort of, extended period of time, where if the real end game here, if the real goal from the administration is to move production into the US for all of these products, because it applies to everything, not just games, but in the context of games, it's so unlikely, to get these new factories built up, new production lines up and running. I mean, even if the decisions are made right now to go ahead and do that, you're still going to feel that pain in the here and now. It's still going to happen for 5, 10 plus years for that manufacturing to get moved over. So no matter what, there would be this sort of very rough period as far as this medium being quite expensive. So it's really uncertain. It's and with the game pricing from Nintendo and what SIE may or may not do, I mean, it's all kind of this unknown territory. But one thing seems pretty certain, which is that Nintendo is taking that step forward of pricing a game just a little bit further than we've seen before. And if other publishers and also Sony follows through with that as well, that remains to be seen. But certain elements and outside factors that are outside of their control might also play a role in that. Now, something else from the Direct, which was really surprising, was Nintendo securing a From Software exclusive, which is called The Dusk Bloods. And this is a brand new From Software game coming 2026. It's a PvPvE experience directed by Hidetaka Miyazaki, and it looks very similar to Bloodborne. I think everybody was watching this trailer, and right away you're like, wow, this kind of looks similar to Bloodborne. It does look more steampunk, I would argue, but there's a little bit of that Victorian feel in there. But you're watching what is a brand new From Software game get revealed, and it's like kind of an exciting thing. And I think everybody in their mind was like, there's no way this is exclusive, but yes, it's exclusive to Nintendo Switch 2. Now, as a reminder, what's also kind of funny about this whole thing is that Sony, we know, is a very big shareholder in Kadokawa. They own 10%, and also they own 14% of From Software directly. So they own some of the parent company and the studio itself. So, I mean, this game, clearly it's one of those things where, it was probably in development for quite a bit. And, it being a PvPvE experience, once people learned it was, multiplayer focused, I don't want to say people checked out, but it's like, oh, that sort of changes when it's not the next sort of big mainline thing from Software. But it's still kind of, people are begging the question of, is this the spiritual successor that Sony won't do or something, which I find a little bit silly because I'm almost certain Sony would love to do more Bloodborne. We never have a straight answer on this, but we can sort of pick up breadcrumbs on what's going on here, and that, maybe From just doesn't have that room, obviously. Hidetaka Miyazaki can only work on and direct so many games, and these games do take years to come out, so it just seems like there maybe wasn't that sort of area for Sony to possibly get in and have From do something with Bloodborne, if there is this running theory that there's a contingency with the Bloodborne IP and that they can't do anything with it unless From Software is involved. And that does seem to make the most sense, given that how has Sony not done anything with Bloodborne? But I just find it a bit silly to look at the Dusk Bloods and think that, Sony dropped the ball or something, which I would actually say, how insane it would be if this game was, let's say, a PS5 exclusive, and I don't know, call it Bloodborne 2, I don't care, but, let's say it was just the exact trailer, exact name, and it comes out and it's a PvPvE experience, a multiplayer game, and that being associated with PlayStation and it being exclusive, and this is post Elden Ring, so so many more people are huge From Software fans, and so to see a From Software game locked away to a PlayStation console again, but it's a multiplayer game, I don't know about you, that would go over very poorly, I find. In this case, it's kind of silly that oh man, well, not silly, it's shocking that Nintendo secured a From Software exclusive, and really that was a bigger statement on their part, given that, back in 2017, third-party support was in question for Nintendo platform, so it really was kind of a big deal for Nintendo to secure Elden Ring on Switch 2, and also a From exclusive as well. So, it was a very shocking announcement, but it it was at least worth noting that, yeah, it does look very similar to Bloodborne, but I would think it kind of looks more steampunk, if anything. Moving on to a new update for the ongoing rumor of Halo coming over to PlayStation hardware. In this case, it's more about how they do it, not necessarily if they'll do it. So recently speaking on the Xbox 2 podcast, Tom Warren from The Verge mentioned that with shipping Halo on new consoles, it might not be the full Master Chief Collection, saying he doesn't think that it'll be every game. So for reference, the Master Chief Collection has Halo 1, 2, 3, ODST, 4, and Reach, but ODST and Reach were added after the fact, and the PC version was on a rolling basis for all those games as well. So it sounds like it might be similar to how it happened with PC. And initially I thought like, okay, it's probably going to be the Master Chief Collection when this does eventually come over. But now seeing that rumor, I think that makes a lot of sense, if only because Halo is such a very large Xbox property. It's pretty much the biggest one, right? So they can only put that on PlayStation once. When they do that, like that's the big leap of faith there. They can only introduce that franchise to this audience one time. It's that first impression. And so do you just ship all those games immediately, or do you roll them out, Halo 1, then maybe another month or two, or however they plan on doing it, right? Let's say it takes a year for all the games to finally show up, but do you want to do that on a rolling basis where fans can slowly digest the franchise, have their time with each game in sequence? And, you know, I think that does actually make a lot more sense and benefit Microsoft, just in the sense that, like, you really only get one shot, and to do it one time all in one go, and then, you know, it also kind of comes and goes where, like, the novelty wears off right away. You could, you know, spend a lot of time doing that and sort of reinvigorate that Halo entry every time it does come out on PlayStation. Moving on to some PlayStation Productions news for The Last of Us HBO, we're hearing from the co-creator, writer, and executive producer Craig Mazin, speaking with The Hollywood Reporter, that he said flat out he is not going to go past the game for the TV show. He even said how that might be seen from people as a cash grab, so he said flat out, I'm not going past the games. And that is quite a different answer from what Neil Druckmann said when he was speaking with IGN last week, where he was asked if the show would go past the games. And Neil said he will leave nothing on the line. He said, and I quote, "As far as everything else, and you're asking me about future games, my time so much is we have to finish the season. We're not quite done. We're almost there. Knock on wood, we get to do it again. Season 3, there's a lot more story we have to cover, as you know with Game 2. And then my hands are pretty full with Intergalactic, the Heretic Prophet." So, kind of a weird answer, but I will say this. If Sony wants it, if HBO wants it, this is one of those things, and Craig made this point too, of like, I'm not doing it, but if, you know, somebody else does, that's how that would play out. So, I would hope, and I think it is something where they respect the property that much to the point where they're not going to pull a Game of Thrones here, and they will kind of let the series finish off on part 2 if there is no part 3 game to start adapting that. So I would be inclined to say, and certainly for PlayStation, I'm sure HBO probably would be the one that wants it more than anybody out of that triangle. But even PlayStation themselves, they do hold this property very close to them. I mean, I know it seems like they do a lot of Last of Us things, but it probably could have looked way worse as far as like, there's not all these spin-offs that we have. We don't have all these crazy different TV series and adaptations, and yeah, they merchandise it, but they don't quite do it to the degree that I think people think they do. So they do keep it a little bit close to the chest, and so I would think for respecting the source material, they will not go past it, but we will see. In other PS Productions news, we're also hearing that Astro Bot is now being considered for an adaptation. That's right. So the head of PS Productions, Asad Kizilbash, was speaking with Variety, and he gave this quote here where he says, "One thing I would say is you have to strike a balance between establishing it as a video game property first and getting it out there. Establishing an audience, establishing a fan base. In the conversations I've had with our film studio, it's important, and that makes it less risky for them, is when there's an established audience. And so when you have a brand new IP, it may not have an established audience." So the article goes on to mention that Astro Bot is a game that Kizilbash is absolutely looking at for its potential to be added to the growing list of adaptations. Now, you may think that I am very excited for this. I'll tell you though, I don't think now is the time. And I think that's kind of what Asad was getting at. is that sure, Astro Bot has a lot of notoriety right now with the amount of awards it won, for example, but that quote very distinctly to me says we have to establish it. And maybe you would say like, oh, they did that, but I think, you know, given the sort of Game of the Year lineup and when you look at a broader spectrum of people that were like watching the TGAs, and it's like, Astro Bot, one, what was that? And two, how does that beat Rebirth and Refantasio? And like, there's a lot of pushback from Astro Bot, understandably so, because the argument I always made is that that's the first time Astro Bot was really able to be exposed to a big audience as far as like also selling a full-scale 2D title to people. You know, it was still very niche. Even if you pre-install it on every PS5, that doesn't mean 60, 70, 80 million people are going to be playing Astro Bot, obviously. So in my eyes, I think if you do a movie or some sort of adaptation like now, I think that's way too soon, and that's asking for Astro to fail, basically. I think you need to do like 2 or 3 more heavy hitters and have it really establish itself as a PlayStation mainstay. So I think that's what Assad was getting at, and I would hope that's maybe how they're looking to approach it. You know, evaluating its potential to maybe do that at some point. Now, with all that said, it is time for Let's Talk Plus, the weekly Let's Talk PlayStation giveaway, where one of you can win a $10 PSN code. I would like to congratulate this viewer right here. I'll be contacting you very soon via email or X, and if you'd like to win a $10 PSN code, it is so simple. Follow the link down below or scan the QR code, enter the Gleam giveaway, and supporting this channel a number of ways can gain you an entry, and I'll announce the winner next week because I'm trying to help pay for your games. Those are some of the stories from this past week that I wanted to talk about with you all, and our Tuesday video was another collection update. Finally, I know it's been a long time since we did one of those, and maybe we'll do more of them now because everyone was seemingly okay with games not necessarily being in packages, but you can see my recent game pickups. And then coming up, probably a video on Tuesday on time, I hope. And we do have another Click R3 going live probably by the time you're watching this. So we do spend a good portion of time discussing not just recent PlayStation stories, but of course the whole Switch 2 pricing thing and what's going on there. So that should be live by the time you're watching this. But that is pretty much it. So that concludes this week's episode of Let's Talk PlayStation. I'm Ryan Benecki. Thank you all so much for talking with me, and I will see you all next Friday.